Well, I hope you're ready to stitch up a dazzling snowflake because that is what we're working on today. Isn't that beautiful? This project has so much shine and so much sparkle, and we're also going to be working with bead spinners. This is not necessary for your project, but it's something that will be really helpful, and I'm going to be giving you tips on how to use the bead spinner with embroidery. So let's get started. So for the first portion of this project, you are going to need the pattern, and from that pattern, you're going to cut out the snowflake. You're going to need your hoop. I'm using a 7-inch hoop, some background fabric. My fabric it's an ivory color with like a very light gold stripe throughout it. You can use a pattern fabric, you can use a plain fabric. You just want to be able to make sure that when you trace your pattern onto the fabric, you're going to be able to see the pattern because you're going to need that for the embroidery. You're going to need something to trace your pattern. I'm using the Clover water erasable marker. I have some washi tape and a pair of fabric scissors. I will be using a bead spinner for this project, and I'll be talking through the tips and everything on how to use it. It's not necessary, but it will be really helpful for this project. So I'm going to be using the single bead spinner, but you could also, if you have the double one, you could definitely use that as well. And then I'm also going to be using 3 different sizes of the Bead Landing Preciosa crystals. I'll be using the 4, 6, and 8 millimeter size crystals in various shades of white and silver and clear. To get started, we are going to hoop up the fabric, which is very simple. You're going to take the hoop apart, put the back of the hoop, the part that doesn't have any hardware, behind the fabric, and the front of the hoop, the part that does have the hardware, on the front of the fabric. And then you are going to tighten your hoop. Now you can see this fabric is kind of wrinkly. However, when I put it in here and tighten it, because this is a small enough project, my wrinkles just disappear. You can definitely iron your fabric. If you want to do that, that's fine. I'm always looking to reduce the amount of steps that I have to take in my tiny little studio, and I have found that this works great. So you're just going to tighten the hoop. You want this fabric very tight inside of the hoop. And so you can see I'm just stretching out the fabric, tightening the hoop as I go. And then once I know that it's tight enough, you want to be able to feel the tension on your fabric. I'm going to cut the hoop out of the fabric, leaving about 2.5, maybe 3 inches of fabric all the way around. I'm using less than a fat quarter of fabric right now because I know that this is a small project. This is a well-loved piece of fabric that I have used for many projects, and it's getting smaller and smaller with every project that I do. And so when I work with it, I need to know that it's going to be a really good project that I love. And this is definitely going to be a project that I'm going to enjoy taking out in the winter every year. This is the part where you will need a light source, and your light source can either be a window. I'm using a light box, which you're going to see turn on. That's going to drive you crazy. So I'll make sure that when I am showing you this part, I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer. I also have the piece of the pattern that I cut out, and you can see that it fits within this hoop. So what I'm going to do now is flip the hoop over, flip the pattern over, make sure that my pattern is where I want it on the hoop. And then I'm going to take my washi tape and I'm going to tape the pattern onto the fabric. And now I'm going to play with the lighting and turn the light box on. Let me get this a little bit closer. Okay, so you can see my pattern through the fabric. I'm going to turn this light off and this light off. There, now you can see the pattern through the fabric. And so all I'm going to do is now trace this onto the fabric, just with my water-soluble marker. And I'm just copying the pattern as exact as I can. This is just one method of tracing your pattern onto your fabric. Another method is before you even cut out your fabric, or you can gauge the size of the fabric that you're going to need. So cut out the section of fabric that you think you're going to need. You can tape the pattern to the window or the light source then, and then tape your fabric on top of that, trace your pattern, and then hoop it up. It really is up to you, but one thing is for certain, you need the pattern on the fabric. And so whatever way works best for you, do it that way. I would stay away from darker fabrics, only because you're going to drive yourself crazy transferring this pattern onto the fabric that way. But if you do choose to try a darker fabric, the one suggestion that I have is to use a white transfer pen or marker or pencil, so that you'll be able to see your markings through the fabric. If I were to use this blue pen on a darker fabric, I would be wasting my time because I wouldn't be able to see the marks that I need for the embroidery. So I'm going to finish doing this and then we're going to get stitching. So I have removed the pattern from the back of the fabric, and this is the point where you want to look at your pattern under the light and just make sure that all of your markings definitely transferred. Some of these lines got a little too light, and so I'm just going over them again. I don't want to be struggling to see my pattern when I am stitching. And I have to give a shout out to my son for helping me come up with the design of this snowflake. He loves to help me design embroidery patterns, and this is one that we worked on the idea together, and he drew it out and I made it electronic, and he can't wait to see it all stitched up. So there it is. My pattern is on the fabric, and now I'm going to grab my embroidery supplies and we're going to get started with this. Okay, so we are going to start with bugle beads. I'm using my good thread from John Bead. I have knotted my thread at the end, and I cut a length of about 12 inches when I'm embroidering with beads. I threaded my needle. Now you'll notice this needle is, I call this my wonky needle. It's very bent. It's not a straight needle. And here's why. These are the bugle beads that I'm using. I have 3 different colors and types. So these are both the check seed beads. You can see they're white and silver. Now these will work for pretty much any standard needle. You just want to pass your needle through the bugle beads to make sure that they're going to work, because you don't want this to happen. Oh, well, you do want that to happen. You don't want, let's see. Now I'm going to try and find a thicker needle and they're all going to work perfectly, which if I were here stitching by myself, not on camera, that wouldn't be happening. You don't want this to happen. You don't want to start threading your needle and then realize that the needle doesn't pass through the bead, because that's just frustrating. So I always, with bugle beads, always test out my needles first. Now the Miyuki bugles are a little different. You can see here that these are the Miyuki, these are the check seed. These are a lot thinner. And so if you are using these, you're going to want to test your needle to make sure that your needle is thin enough to pass through them. And it can be a little tricky because with fabric, you want your needle to be thin enough to pass through the bead, but you also need it to embroider. So you need it to be sturdy enough to be able to stitch through fabric. So that's why I have this wonky little needle, because it has served me very well. It works with the thinnest of beads, and it also works well with fabric. So I'm going to be using this needle for the Miyukis, and I don't know, I might be using one of the others for the other beads, but that's just a little side note that you want to keep in mind when you are using bugle beads, which I'm going to be doing a lot of for this pattern. So since I have this needle threaded with the Miyukis, let's get started with that. Now I want a variety of beads in this project. It's called a Dazzling Snowflake or Dazzling Stitches. So I want there to be a lot of shine. And because I'm sticking with a limited color palette, I want those limited colors to really stand out, which I think we're going to have plenty of with these. This is like an iridescent. This is more of just a shiny white. And then we've got our silver for our sparkle. So I'm just going to be using the bugles right here on the center part of each of the snowflakes. And I'm going to start at the top, not completely at the top, because I have other plans for what I'm going to want to do with the beading around this, but I want to kind of fill in this area. So you can see that I just brought my needle and thread up through the fabric, placed a bead on the needle and took it through, and that is enough to keep that bead on the fabric. So I'm going to try that again. I'm bringing it up and I'm going to vary these beads. So now I'm going to grab another bead, take my needle down. Now I stitch with bugle beads a lot, so I can gauge the size and how much space it's going to take up on the fabric. If you are new to stitching with bugle beads, another way to do this to make sure that your bead is going to lay flat on the fabric, you're going to take your bead on your needle, pull the thread all the way through, and then before taking your needle down on the fabric, just lay the bead down to make sure that it's going to lay flat. And then once it's laying flat, I can just take my needle down right through the fabric, and I know that it's going to be in the right place. So this is going to take a little bit, filling up these areas with the beads. You can see they're going to lay nice and flat on here. I'm going to vary the colors that I use and the placement. I don't want any specific pattern for this project, pattern with the beads, that is. I want them to just be shiny and sparkly, and that's my goal with this. They're going to be laying right next to each other without any big gaps in the fabric or any big gaps to see fabric through the beads. I just want them to be nice and lined up and uniform next to each other. So I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to stitch my beads on. When I come to the end of this thread, I'm going to show you how I tie off my thread and beads when I'm embroidering a project on fabric like this. So I have stitched this row right here, and now I have come to, I have enough thread that I can tie off a knot. I don't want to keep stitching because I just want to stitch this row, and then I'm going to start the next one, then the next one. When I'm using a white fabric like this, I don't like to carry my stitches because you always end up seeing them from the front. So I'm just very careful with white fabrics. So what I'm going to do with my thread to end this is I'm going to take my needle and thread under a few of the last stitches, and I'm just going to tie a knot. Now this is white on white, so I don't know how well this is showing up, but I'm basically going to just do this a few times. It just gives me a little security that my beads aren't going anywhere. My thread is tied off. Everything's good. And I might do that 3 times. Again, I just like to feel, I don't think anything's going to happen. I've never had beads break or fall off of a hoop, but it makes me feel a little bit better knowing that my stitches are tied off and everything is secure. So I'm absolutely loving how this looks. It is in a nice straight line. Again, it's not perfect because I don't want it to be. I want it to look very organic. But you can see all the beads are lined up nicely. So now I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to do each of these larger sections with the bugle beads. Here is the snowflake stitched with all of the bugle beads. I think it looks really pretty like that. I love the mix of the colors. And so the next part, we're also going to be mixing colors. We're going to be working on these little side bars of the snowflake. So I'm going to get more beads. These are the size 6 check seed beads. And you can see I have a variety of colors. I've got crystal and silver and white, 2 different shades of white. I love mixing beads. And so that's what we're going to do right now, because again, I don't want these to be in any sort of pattern. I want the whites to all be mixed in together, and the silvers, and I want there to be sparkle. By the way, these tubes, I'm always asked how these tubes open, and you can see how I did that. The square ones open from the bottom, which makes it super easy. Just a little tip, something I'm asked about a lot when I teach in-person workshops. So I'm getting all of my snowflake colors onto my bead tray. And I just give it a little mix. I'm going to get some more thread, and I'm just going to thread another needle, doing the same exact thing, knotting the end of my thread and then threading the needle. With the size 6 seed beads, you don't have to worry about the needle quite as much because these are really good and they'll pass through most needles. They're very easy to stitch with. They're a great beginner bead if you're just learning to stitch with embroidery and beads and everything. I always recommend the size 6 because you get a nice visual and they're also really easy to work with. So we are just going to pick one of the side shoots, and I'm going to bring my needle and thread up, and I already lost my thread. So we're going to pick one of the side shoots to get started, and I'm just going to start at the edge, and I'm going to work towards the part that I already have beaded. This is a more of an open weave fabric, and so I pulled my thread right through, so I'm just going to be careful each time, or just as I'm getting started. Now this is where I am just randomly placing my beads. I don't want them to be uniform. You can see the sizes are very slightly different, just the shape of them. And I'm just gonna like lay it down in place first before I actually stitch it to make sure that I have enough. So I have 6 beads on there. And I'm not exactly meeting my bugle beads, but I am filling that area. Now, you can see that this is still movable, and these are larger beads, plus I have an open weave fabric. So I don't want these falling off at any point, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up at the top, pull it nice and tight, but not too tight. You don't want to rip your thread and beads right through the fabric. And I'm going to take the needle through one more time. And I'm just going to make sure that these are really stitched in place and they're not going anywhere. Now you can see there's still some movement, but not nearly what there was before. And it feels like they are on there. When I move the hoop, those aren't shifting around at all. So now I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to bring my thread over here. And I'm, again, just pulling gently to tighten it up over there. And put a few of my beads on. I'm going to try 6 again to make sure that that works. Lay it down to just gauge your size. That's about right. I actually might be able to sneak one more on there. Let's see. I think I can. And now I'm going to do the same thing. Bring my needle back up and go through it again to secure it. Pulling it nice and tight. So you can see this is one of the little, I don't know what to call these, the snowflake fronds. Just the snowflake bar. This is one of the snowflake bars that only has one on each side. And you can see these each have 2. I don't want to carry my thread over to here because remember what I talked about before with a white fabric, white threads. I don't want to see my thread going from here to here if the light hits this the wrong way and I see threads through it. So what I'm going to do is make sure that my thread is down on the back side of the fabric. Flip it over, and I am just going to tie a knot to secure my stitches and my thread. And you can see I'm just kind of, well, you probably can't see because the thread is fine and I'm working on white fabric, so it's probably trickier to see. I'm just going under a few of the stitches that I already stitched and just tying a knot. And I kind of do that like 2 times, sometimes 3, just to give it a little extra security. Again, working with a lot of beads, I always just tie knots with beads just to make sure that things are nice and secure. So I am going to do that with each one of the snowflake bars. Well, I think it is looking very snowflakey already. And it's just going to get even more so. So I've done my check seed bugles, and then I've done the size 6 beads on the edges. Now I'm planning for a lot of dimension in the center. And so that is the last part that we're going to do. We want to do dimensional things last because we don't want to get our embroidery threads and beads stuck on anything as we're bringing our needle in and out of the fabric. So now we're going to be using long strands of beads, and for that I'm going to be showing you how to use the bead spinner. So there's 2 options for bead spinners. This is a double bead spinner, and this, if you wanted to use, for instance, I have silver beads that I'm going to be using, and then I have shades of white. If you wanted to keep these separate and have balance out what you want to use, you could put all the silver beads in one section and you could mix up all of the white ones in the other section, and then you'd pick and choose what you wanted to use. For my project, because I've been mixing the whites and the silvers and everything the whole time, I'm going to be doing that this time. I'm going to be using just the single bead spinner, and I'm going to be mixing all of my size 8 beads together to get the blend. This is the fun part. I love seeing all the beads go together, and I'm just going to estimate how many. I'm probably going to use half of the tube on this. So I'm going to put those in, and then I'm going to add some of the whites. You can always add more to this depending on your project. And when you're finished, you could either sort them all out and get them back in their tubes, or you could just consider this your white and silver mix, which I might do. and add those. I sometimes store mine just in a little baggie, the mixes that I've made, and then I can pull them out for whenever I am using a mix like that on a project. So there is my mix. And I will just give it a little spin, get the beads all mixed up. This really is fun and very calming. If you need something to calm yourself, I definitely recommend making a bead mix and just spinning away your worries. There's nothing wrong with that. Before I even thread my needle, which is a curved needle, and these come with the bead spinners. Before I even thread that, I just want to show you how easy it is to gather a strand of beads. So I'm spinning this counterclockwise, and once you get it spinning, you're just going to tuck the curved end of that needle in there, and look how quickly we have made a strand of beads. I'm messy with these, but that quickly. So for the project that we are working on, this is going to be great. And I love the variety. Every strand that you string is going to be a little different. So let's get this threaded up, and I'm going to show you how to add these to your project. So we are going to need 2 needles threaded. The one needle can be your curved needle, and the other needle we are going to set aside because we are going to be couching the rows of beads onto this project. So I'm just tying my knot, and I'm going to thread a regular needle. So you're going to set that needle aside. So I'm threading a second needle. This needle is only going to be used to bring your thread up through the fabric because this is a little tricky. We are starting with the fabric, or we're starting with our thread on the fabric, and then we're going to connect the bead spinner to this thread. So now I'm undoing that needle. I'm grabbing my bead needle or my spinner needle, and I'm going to thread this and pull it all the way through. I like to leave a decent amount of a tail on my thread just so that I'm not pulling it through and losing my thread and my beads. So you can see that I'm attached to the fabric and I have my spinner, and now I'm just going to set this aside because most of my work is going to be done with the bead spinner now. And so I'm going to start spinning it and gathering beads. And once I get a decent amount on there, I just kind of slide them down. And we're not stitching them in place yet. We're just going to let them gather on the thread. But you can see how quickly I am threading the needle for the beads, with the beads, and how quickly this outline is going to get stitched up. I like that I don't even have to think about the color placement. It just does it all for me. All right, so I am going to stop there for now. I'm going to unthread this needle, put the spinner aside, and now we have this nice long strand of beads. I'm going to re-thread it with my needle. This isn't exactly necessary, but I like feeling that I'm directing my threads and I have a needle on here. It helps me. And I'm kind of setting that aside. And then I'm bringing back my other needle and thread that doesn't have anything at all attached to it. And where do I start my beads? Okay, so my goal, before I even stitch anything down, I'm just going to demonstrate what my goal is. My goal is to outline the snowflake with the strand of beads. And you can see I'm just going to be following the blue lines. Now, it feels a little tedious, and it is best to work with a desk or a table. A lot of times when I'm embroidering, I'm just sitting on my couch or in a chair and I'm holding my project. This one really does. You need a surface to work on. And I'm not going to be laying my whole strand of beads out at once. I'm going to be working in small sections. So to couch this strand on here, I'm kind of setting aside my needle, and I'm just going to work in little sections. So I'm going to bring my needle and thread up, and what you're doing is just securing these beads in place. This thread gets hidden between the beads, and you can just kind of follow along your little outline of blue. And I'm just kind of nestling them right alongside the check or the bugle beads. And just following along the line. You can bring your needle and thread on the inside of that blue line or on the outside. I kind of vary depending on what I'm stitching down. If I'm going around curves, it's a little bit easier to have my needle and thread coming from the inside and going towards the outside. And you can see how these beads are just laying so nicely. And I'm stitching down the row. And I'm just going to continue with this. Once I'm done this, I can rethread my needle onto the curved beading needle. You can see why I said it's not exactly necessary to have unthreaded and rethreaded this, but I like having the needle to just kind of hold the thread of beads that are all stranded. I know I'm not going to lose it. It just makes me aware of where the end of my thread is. And so that's why I handle it that way. And I'm just going to keep couching these along here. So here's what I have so far. You can see I have that all attached. This is definitely the fiddliest part of this project. So please be patient. It's going to turn out really cool, and it's going to look neat to have all of the different colors mixed in. But I've gotten to the first fiddly part that you are going to get to at some point. The thread that I'm using for couching my stitches is very short now, and I'm running out of it. So I need to tie it off. I still have beads here, however. And so as I do this, this is why I have my needle here, so I can keep track of the end of that. I'm just going to tuck that aside, flip it over, and tie off my couching thread. And I'm going to do 2 nice ties. Again, I know this is white on white, and so it's a little tricky for you to see, but you want to just secure your beads at this point and secure your couching stitch. So that's what I'm doing. And then I'm going to rethread this and continue with my, let's cut the right thread. I'm going to continue with my couching. So before I flip it, I'm going to make sure that I have my bead strand that's still loose. And I'm going to thread a new needle and just continue on. So at some point you are going to come to the end of the thread that all of your beads are on. So you can see I'm just in the middle of adding this row of beads, and I've run out of thread and I still have a ways to go. So the way that you handle that is come to a point where it makes sense to stop. Either take a few beads off and stop at like a corner or somewhere where it's going to be easy to pick up with your row of beads again. And so what I'm going to do is just make sure that these beads are tucked tightly against the other beads. I don't want to leave any gaps. And I'm just taking my row of beads down, my thread. So I've kind of ended it right there. And then you're going to do exactly the same thing that we do when we end any strand of beads. You're going to tie a nice knot. And I do this a few times, again, because you have a lot of beads going on and you want it to be nice and tight. So you need a nice knot against the back of your work. And when you are comfortable with that, you can see it ends right there. Now what I'm going to do is string another string of beads and start all over again right there and continue around. So you see I made it pretty far, but it's hard to gauge exactly how much thread, like if you were doing this all in one step without having to rethread your beading string, it's really hard to gauge that. And so at some point you are going to have to take it down through the back and restart and restring your beads. Here is what your snowflake will look like when the edges are all beaded. I mean, how cool is this? So yes, it's a tedious little job, but it's much faster to stitch the beads on using the bead spinner with the beads this way. Much faster to do it rather than stitching one bead at a time. So now that we have the edges done, we are going to focus on adding some dimension in the center. So now we are going to add some dimension using the Bead Landing Preciosa crystal beads. You can see I have 3 different sizes here. I have the 8mm, which are the largest, and then I have the 6mm, which are slightly smaller, and then the 4mm. And I have different colors too. I have 3 different colors. So we're going to add these to the outer parts of the snowflake, and then we're going to also work some in towards the center. So the first step is just taking the strands apart so that I have something to work with. When I'm done using these, I do the same thing I do with my mixes, and I'll store them in a little bag just to keep them nice and organized. And I keep the tag with them just so that I always remember what size they are and what color and everything in case I ever need to replace something mid-project. So we're going to start with our threaded needle, and we are stitching these on individually, and I'm starting with the largest of the snowflake bars. And so I'm just going to pick a spot kind of in the middle but a little offset, and this is where we're going to put the larger of the beads. So I'm going to just grab one and stick it on my needle like this. And then take it down. We're not going down in the same hole. We're going down next to it, leaving room for the bead. And then pull it through. And it will need some readjustment. And this is another one of the beads that once it's on, I will add another stitch through it because it's a heavier bead. And I want to make sure it's really on there good. And so I just do the same exact thing. I'm going to come through it and take it down again. So once I have that, I'm just going to work my way around this way. I have one of the side shoots, and so I'm going to use a smaller bead. I think for this I'm going to use the 6mm. A different color. I'm going to try and vary the colors because again, I've varied the colors all along. So you can see it's just simply stitching one bead at a time on. And because I'm going like short distances, I'm okay with carrying my thread. I've been looking at it closely and I'm not seeing any threads through the fabric, but you can decide. If your fabric is even more sheer than mine, the white fabric, you might want to tie your bead off after every time. And that will take a little bit more time, but you don't want to see your threads through it. So just keep checking, which I've been doing all along. So now I'm going to skip over here and I'm going to add one of the even smaller beads. And so this is all you do. You're just going to keep going around in your circle of the snowflake and just adding beads to give it a little bit more shine, a little bit more, I just think it's more noticeable. And this is going to be a very bejeweled snowflake, so have fun with adding the color and shine to this. So the crystals are all stitched on, and I think they really give a nice point to each of the snowflake bars. Now it's at this point that we're not stitching anymore around the edges. And if you look closely at mine, you can still see some of the little blue marks from my transfer pen. This is the point where I take care of them because they become a little distracting to me and I want to see it nice and cleaned up. So that's when I will just take a Q-tip and some water and I will just go around the edges and it gets rid of any of the blue marks that are there. You can see they disappear. It's going to make your fabric wet. And so I do this and then I'll let it sit and dry before I move on to the next point or to the next part of the process. But I just like to take care of this and then it disappears the blue and I can start to really see the snowflake take shape. So I have let this dry and now it's finally time to work on this little center section. Again, you can choose whether or not you want to keep adding dimension to this, but after you see how this turns out, I think you're going to want to work on this center section. But if you like it as is, you could also be done here. So just like every real snowflake is different, every stitched and beaded snowflake is going to be different. So I'm bringing back my bugle beads and I'm keeping the smallest, the 4mm crystals. And I'm just going to start dead center and I'm bringing my needle and thread up and I'm going to add a bugle bead and a crystal. Now, once that is on there, I'm holding on to the crystal and letting the bugle bead sit right against the fabric. And as I'm holding on to the crystal, I'm now going to take my needle back down through the bugle. And then I'm going to take my needle all the way down. Being careful that it's not catching on all of the other beads that we have going on. Now, you can see that if I lay this down, it means that my tension isn't super tight with the thread. I want it to stand up and I'm going to have a bunch of standing bugles all the way around. So I'm going to be holding the tension like that as I do the same exact thing with another bugle and another crystal right next to it. As you get several here, they will all kind of support each other too, which is going to give us that dimension that we want for the center of the snowflake. So again, I'm putting the crystal and the bugle on. I hold the crystal and I take my needle down through the bugle. And I just hold on to the crystal until it's really close to the bugle and then I just let it go. And then I'm going to add another one. I am filling up the entire center section with these standing bugle and crystal sections. And I'm not switching the color of my bugle beads like I did when I was laying them flat. Right now, all I want to see is shine, and so I picked the color that is shiniest, and the same with my crystal. I'm I'm just adding shine to this. So I'm using the same colors the whole way around. And now it's just filling in a section, the same exact process, and I'm just filling it in. How gorgeous is this? I just can't get over. I love the sparkle so much. So there's a warning there. I did use a lot of the crystals. I used 2 strands of the, let's see, the 4mm beads. So just have enough if you're going to fill the whole center, plus use them on the outer part. From the side, you can see there's lots of dimension. You'll also notice there's quite a weight to this hoop. Not excessive, but you'll feel the weight of the beads if you are stitching this. So the one thing that you are going to want to do is just tighten your fabric, because you don't want it pulling towards the center. I just like to, because my fabric is striped, I'm just being really careful how I pull the fabric. So I just like gently pull it. I'm keeping track of my background that it's not getting stretched out. And then I just keep tightening the hoop as I do that. So now you are done. You are ready to finish up the hoop and hang your snowflake. So I'm going to finish this the way I finish all of my embroidery hoops. After I've made sure that it's fully tightened, I'm going to trim around the edges of my fabric, leaving about 1/2 inch. This will be folded backwards, and so I just want to make sure that I'm trimming enough that I can easily fold it backwards over the hoop, but I don't want to leave so much that there's excess fabric and the fabric is actually touching the hoop when we fold it backwards. And once you've trimmed the fabric, you're going to turn it over. I'm using my white school glue, and I just run a nice bead of glue all the way around the edges. This dries clear, and it also dries and will hold your fabric really nicely. I've been using this method for years, and I really have found that it's the best way to finish hoops so that the fabric doesn't start gaping out of the hoop, or especially with a project like this that has a lot of weight to it, you want something that is going to be nice and secure. And so then I just pick an edge and start folding the fabric over, and I work my way all the way around, and then let it dry, and then we'll check out the finished hoop. I like to give the glue plenty of time to dry before I do anything more with this. An hour is about good, but you just want to make sure before you hang it on a wall or set it against something that the glue is completely dry. So then you are finished, and here's our reveal. Just beautiful sparkle, a really cool neutral sort of project that you can do whatever with. You could actually do this in different colors. I chose the white because I wanted to challenge myself to do white on white. A lot of my work is very colorful, and so when I'm actually doing a neutral project like this, it is more work for me than a colorful project. So if you ever see me doing neutrals, know that it's not always my go-to and that it can sometimes be a struggle. But I think this neutral palette is just perfect. So now to really finish it up, I am always collecting little bits of trim and ribbon for just this purpose. I am going to cut a small piece of trim, and I'm going to attach it just to the top of the hoop. I actually think this one is really nice, so I'm going to cut a length of that. You don't need a ton, just enough to tie a little knot and secure it to your hoop. So I just take the trim through the hardware at the top of the hoop, and I like to make sure that it's about even. Just like that. And then I'll just tie a little knot. Sometimes with trims, they're a little bulkier, and so you just have to make sure that your knot isn't too bulky. So I like to pull it like nice and tight at the top. But now that has given me the perfect way to hang this on a wall. I have lots of gallery walls that I switch up seasonally, and this white snowflake is going to be perfect for my winter wall. I would love to see your snowflake projects, so if you stitch one, be sure to tag me, and I hope you enjoyed this. Happy winter stitching!